Here's a summary of what Richard and I will be covering over the next few minutes. It's a whistle-stop tour of the selling process from go to woe. We'll also look at all too common errors that you'll want to avoid, how to rescue a struggling campaign, and dealing with unsolicited offers. Richard, a great deal of attention and discussion is focused on the timing of a property sale. Vendors and agents quite often agonise about choosing an auction date or a private sale campaign period that might deliver an extra special result, one that could squeeze an extra $10,000 or $20,000 out of prospective buyers. Is all that consideration really worthwhile?
Thank you, Jarrod, and good evening, everyone. To answer that question, let's take a look at the property cycle. This chart from CoreLogic RP data shows the Melbourne auction market over the last 5 years. The black bars represent auction volumes and the blue line is the auction clearance rate. The chart shows a property market that was weakening until around the end of 2011. The recovery in volumes and auction clearance rates began in early 2012 and has, by and large, continued until the present day. That's a brief look at the lows and highs of the property supply cycle, a story that often plays out over several years. I'd like to focus on seasonal features of the Melbourne property market, specifically the spring market. Each blue tire highlights within a calendar year the period from early August to Christmas. The orange arrows emphasize the tendency for auction volumes to grow throughout spring and early summer. There's the odd interruption, such as the Grand Final or the Melbourne Cup, but overall the trend is unmistakable. Let's take a closer look at auction clearance rates. As the red arrows illustrate, there is a downward trend over spring. These two parameters are, of course, related and inversely correlated. As supply builds through spring, the likelihood of a successful auction falls.
Thanks, Richard. So does the chart mean that our viewers should be putting their house or apartment onto the market ASAP, or perhaps holding off for a little while?
Jarrod, my investment philosophy for investors has always been buy, hold, never sell, and repeat the process. So I'm not naturally comfortable at encouraging anyone to sell, if they're in possession of a high quality asset, that is. Of course, this advice only applies to investors and it goes by the wayside if other events in life require you to offload an asset. With homeowners, buying and selling is driven by life events. So to return to your question, should one sell now? Well, early spring is a good time to list a property as portrayed by the chart on the earlier slide. Demand is strong in early spring. It tends to pick up more quickly from the winter break than supply. The other great benefit of selling early in spring is that it can present you the chance to buy a replacement property before the end of the calendar year when supply is very strong. So if you synchronize your purchase and settlement timings perfectly, say a long settlement on your sale and a short settlement on your purchase, you could execute the perfect transition, a move out of your old home and into the new home all before Christmas.
Okay, so now that we've decided to sell, what's the first step in the process?
The first and most important step is selecting the real estate agent. For obvious reasons, it is vital to find the right agent. And by right agent, I mean the right person. The wrong agent will likely see you forego several $1,000s on the sale price and may even be responsible for the property not selling at all. Property does not sell itself, even the best assets. Estate agents are often maligned, but the best ones are highly skilled professionals and at the end of the day worth every dollar. Find the agencies in your area that have a good reputation for selling property similar to yours and try to secure the best agent within that agency. Never, ever, under any circumstances, try to sell property on your own. It won't end well, despite what you might read about DIY vending. Appointing an agent needs to be a really rigorous process, akin to hiring an employee. Subject prospective agents to a job interview. It's not about choosing the agent who claims that they can achieve the highest auction price or is prepared to do the job for the least commission. On the screen are a few of the questions you might like to ask the candidates. Once you have your agent, you're no longer alone. You'll have a specialist to provide recommendations on the various aspects of the campaign. The first item on this collective agenda will be the method of sale. So will it be an auction, private treaty, or something else? Typically, the choice will be relatively obvious. There will be a standout method for your type of property in your area at this particular point in the property cycle. Now, generally, if you have a property where the agent is confident he can draw out a reasonable pool of potential buyers in a short space of time, then choose an auction. If, on the other hand, buyers are a rarer species for your property, then go for a private sale. Now, there is also the option of going off-market or via expressions of interest. These methods are quite niche and generally not recommended for most mainstream vendors. When properties are off-market, the estate agent eschews the usual megaphone marketing techniques, such as advertising, billboards, and so on, and offers the property to a few potential buyers. It's not really a recipe for maximising the sales price. Indeed, off-market sales are often driven by other factors such as a desire for privacy or the need for an expedited sale. Expression of interest is a form of private treaty sale where the agent invites prospective buyers to make offers within a certain time frame. It is typically used for very high-end, multi-million-dollar properties where there are a few buyers and it is hard to ascertain the going market rate for a property. It would seem to be stating the obvious that a well-presented property will be more likely to perform versus one that isn't. Yet despite this, it is remarkable how many properties we visit that fail this test. And it's not necessarily about doing a complete makeover. Most of the work actually can be relatively superficial, as the list on the screen shows. So ultimately, it is creating the space for the open for inspection visitor to imagine themselves and their possessions in that property. Now, Jarrod, what are your pet hates when you go out inspecting properties?
One of my pet hates, Richard, is seeing furniture that doesn't fit into any particular room. So we tend to see it quite often in a property that perhaps is leased, because in most circumstances a tenant doesn't purchase purchase furniture for that specific property. And what you can then find is that it really makes the room feel a lot smaller, even though the room may well be a good size. And that can really restrict the potential for people to be able to see the great aspects of that property.
You know, sometimes vendors can feel a little marginalised by the whole selling process. They can feel their home become something like a product, and they are shunted pillar to post to accommodate all the requirements that go with the campaign. The presentation of the property is a key area where the owner can take some ownership of the process and have an important role to maximise return. Saying all that, it is possible and indeed important that the vendor takes an active interest in the whole campaign. Be an informed client who holds your agent to account, and you will receive better service. First of all, make sure the agent provides a thorough campaign plan that provides detail on all the aspects of the marketing. how much online advertising will there be? How much spend will be devoted to traditional print? What's the breakdown between local papers and metropolitan mastheads? And why? What's the reasoning for this mix? So the agent should provide a clear view of when the property will be open for inspection, and if an auction, when's the big date. The agent shouldn't just rely on your advertising dollars. They should be actively marketing the property to known buyers on their database. So you want someone who has a close knowledge of motivated buyers who may have just sold, or for example, have a budget that's comparable to yours. So it's important to set a benchmark at the start about what the agent's expectations are for the property. This way, you can hold them accountable to that target. It's also a defense against a common agent device, and that is systematically revising price expectations down. That's the agent who was gung-ho that you'd get X hundred thousands of dollars for your property when he or she was pitching for your business. 1 week into the campaign, of course, they're telling you to expect $10,000 less, and by the end of the campaign, they've knocked $50,000 off the likely total. Now, once the campaign is underway, the agent should be in regular contact by phone and on email to advise how things are going. There's a few important metrics on the screen, and if they're tardy about this, point it out and demand more. If you were robust in the agent selection process and been an engaged vendor, your sale will be a success, let's say 95% of the time. So make sure you do those two things. But on occasion, it becomes evident that the campaign isn't firing. For instance, if a 4-week auction campaign isn't delivering much interest after a couple of weeks, well, it's time to escalate matters. Have a firm discussion with the agent. If they don't seem to be in control of circumstances and don't have your confidence, escalate your concern to higher up within the agency. Regardless, it is always a good idea to have a principal of the agent involved as well. Now, a property generally struggles for one of two reasons. It's either been poorly marketed or it's mispriced. The price estimate has been set too low or too high. Take a closer look at the marketing material, especially the advertising copy. Ask yourself, is it compelling? If not, it may need to be rewritten. Often a property struggles because there is a big gap between the claims in the advertising copy and the reality of the dwelling. Now, we may all expect some puffery in advertising, but some copywriters just go too far, damaging the credibility of the proposition. Sometimes you see an ad for a 3-bedroom house, which really at the end of the day is a 2-bedder and a small study. Those looking for a 3-bedroom house dismiss it as soon as they see the floor plan, whilst the group most likely to buy the property, those after a 2-bedroom house, never see the ad in the first place. Now, the problem may lie with the quote. If the number is out of line with what prospective buyers expect for this sort of property in that location, either too high or too low, it may result in little or no interest. Should you change your quote range or listed price? That's something you'll need to discuss in detail with the agent. Ultimately, reducing the asking price may be necessary. It's usually less awkward in private treaty sales where vendors are often negotiated down from the initial list price. For auctions, it tends to be a glaring signal of a struggling campaign. It is usually better to grit your teeth and stick with the current quote range, but for the agent to word up parties that the reserve is likely to sit comfortably within the quote range. You may dread that the auction will fail. Ultimately, vendors should not necessarily fear a property being passed in. This is when a good agent earns their fee through an intense process of engaging all those who showed an interest in the property, and by identifying what will get one person over the line, such as offering a longer or shorter settlement period. Sometimes more drastic action is required. Propose to the agent that a second agency is engaged to support the campaign with fees, for example, split 50-50. This is known as a conjunctional sale, and it can often quickly throw up a willing buyer who simply didn't move in the first agency circles. Now, your incumbent may not be thrilled at the prospect of losing half their fee, but a wise one will recognise that half the fees are better than nothing from an aborted sale. Finally, consider taking the property off the market, resting it for a few months, and then relisting it with a completely refreshed listing, new copy, rearranged furniture, and new photography, and possibly with a new agent. It can be better to retreat and regroup rather than make too many concessions just to sell the property. You'll have learnt a lot from the first attempt and be the stronger for it.
Thanks, Richard. Good advice. Let's talk about what is one of the most important parts of the process, and one which us professionals really relish, but perhaps the element most feared by everyone else. That's the negotiations. It's really not about seeing it as a duel, is it, between the two sides?
That's absolutely correct, Jarrod. It isn't a fight that one side must win. As the vendor, it is important to maintain control of the process so that if and when a decision is made to accept an offer, you're actually doing it willingly. You don't want to be bounced into selling a property by the intensity of the process. We frequently see vendors selling well short of what they could have achieved. Being clear and firm what your expectations are is absolutely crucial. Indeed, the final negotiations is as much about managing your agent and the auctioneer as it is the other side. When it comes to auctions, start the auction day having a firm grasp of what is the minimum price you're willing to sell for. If you've been monitoring sales in your area over recent weeks, you should actually have a pretty good idea. But keep this number close to your chest. It may be the minimum you'll accept, but you want the agent and the auctioneer to extract more. Now, during the auction, there is a tendency for the agent to encourage vendors to put the property on the market sooner than is necessary. Once the property is on the market, you, the vendor, become an observer. The outcome will be dictated by the auctioneer and those attending the auction. Now, all too frequently, a vendor is advised to declare the property on the market as there seems to be lots of bidding momentum and it's just a case of bringing it home. But horror, as soon as the property is declared on the market, the bidding dries up and the vendor has to accept a suboptimal result. So be wary of putting the property on the market if you're yet to reach a satisfactory level. Generally, in our experience, it is better to pass the property in. One can usually extract more money from the highest bidder. If the property is passed in, this brings you into a new realm of negotiation. Let's call it the one-on-one. That's also the form of negotiation that's the centerpiece of private treaty sales. Now, time precludes me going into detail about this area right now, but perhaps we can talk about it during questions if anyone is interested.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. It's now time for a bit of introspection on the part of our prospective vendors. Whilst we can look elsewhere for reasons why a sale perhaps has gone a little badly, the responsibility ultimately does lie with the vendor.
That's absolutely right, Jarrod. And, you know, at the end of the day, the biggest problem is inertia. Having the knowledge that it's time to act, but then not following through. It's generally a sin that is punished more when the prevaricator is a buyer. A lack of action can see the hapless buyer paying tens of thousands of dollars more because they didn't act when they were ready. But it can punish vendors as well, especially if they are holding a property that isn't performing well relative to the market. One doesn't want to be stuck in underperforming assets, and the best time to sell poor assets is when the market is strong. Another major error is a poor choice of agent. We've discussed this already, but it's worth recapping. So don't select yourself as the agent, and make sure you find an agent with a really strong reputation. Now, the next set of bullet points demand serious contemplation by the prospective vendor. Don't be short-sighted as a client. The one who penny pinches on marketing, doesn't participate actively in the process, remains willfully ignorant of market conditions, gets greedy when the agent has secured them a really good standout offer, or doesn't communicate with their agent. Finally, for this slide, at the end of the day, try not to worry too much, especially about the things you can't control. For the things you can control, the various items we've discussed already, stem the worry by doing your part to make the process a success.
Richard, I'd like to briefly turn to the unsolicited offer. The knock on the door from a neighbour or a developer who wants to buy your home. It can be quite a shock to an unsuspecting owner. What should the owner do in these circumstances?
Well, the first and most important thing is to say very, very little. So what I suggest is listen politely, but give no indication of whether you are an interested party and what dollar amount will seal the deal. So, you know, Jarrod, it's a marvellous position to be in. The neighbour or developer has approached you because your property has special value for them, something that they cannot obtain by buying in the current market. With neighbours, the attraction is usually obvious. They're looking for the opportunity to extend their home. They have limited options in this respect. Now, developers have more options, but there is substantial competition for sites that are large enough for the construction of apartments, whilst being located in suitably high land value areas that are not subject to tough restrictions. Now, your first job is getting a handle on the approximate fair market value of your property. Given that many people in this situation haven't been watching the market closely before they are approached speculatively by a developer, getting up to speed is critical. Speak to some outside parties. Obtain a valuation or possibly two. Ask the opinion of an independent estate agent or a buyer's advocate with experience in the area. Do your own research about recent sales in the area. Then investigate what the property is worth to the developer or neighbour in its intended changed use. With a developer, try to ascertain the likely building costs and the final selling price of the subsequently built apartments based on similar developments in your area. Now, experienced negotiators like to keep their cards close to their chest and encourage the other side to reveal themselves. Don't feel that you necessarily have to make the first move. Instead, ask the developer to make the first offer. Indeed, you may put off ever making a counteroffer until the end of the negotiations if possible. In short, there is no need to reveal what you're prepared to sell for until the very end. So ask the developer to explain why they think their offer is fair value. Of course, don't accept this. Tell them it is too low and give some reasons based on your research. They may come back with another better offer, repeat until there is a deadlock. Then go back with a figure that is higher than the minimum that you would be willing to accept and provide some reasons why they should pay this. Keep repeating this process until you reach a point where you believe you've received a good offer. Now, typically, you should expect to extract a premium from a developer that's between 30 to 50% higher than the current market price for the existing property. If negotiation is not your strong point, then get independent representation.
Okay, so that ends our presentation part of this evening. We'd now like to turn to some questions. As I mentioned at the start, a number of you have provided us with some questions during the registration process, so we'll answer those. But if you do have any more questions that come to mind, just type them into the question box and we'll endeavour to address as many as we can. Okay, so the first one I've got here from Donald Richard. He asks, should I consider a stylist or adding rental furniture when selling?
Well, we've mentioned the subject of presentation, and we believe presentation is so incredibly important, and one of the really important aspects to achieving an optimum sale result is the ability to create emotion. And emotion can add tens of thousands of dollars to the end sale price. So getting a stylist in, someone who can provide a fresh perspective, stand back, take a look at the property, both on the outside and the inside, is incredibly important. On the subject of whether you should be hiring in rental furniture, well, it depends on the type of property and on the existing furnishings. So it's not an automatic given that you're out there paying for the hire of furniture. But I can only say that in this day and age, getting the presentation right is crucially important.
Yeah, that all sounds very good. I think that's pretty well spot on.
Yeah. So now Katrina's asked a very good question. How do I undertake my price research?
Well, if we're looking from a selling perspective, which is what our presentation tonight is all about, the best thing to do, Katrina, is to start by attending as many open for inspections and auctions of similar type properties to your own in the surrounding areas to give yourself a really good feel for what market activity is like, not just from a price point of view, but also to see who else is participating, what the likely buyers are in that area. It's really about pounding the pavement as much as possible to get a good feel for what these properties are worth, and that will hopefully then give you a good indication as to where you should be setting your reserves depending on the method of sale that you're looking at.
So it's really about direct comparison, isn't it, as best you can?
Absolutely. The similar type properties will definitely give you the best indication of what yours is going to be worth.
Yeah.
Richard, I've got another one here. This one's from Karen. Do the same rules apply to vendors across locations when selling an investment property? So, for example, in the inner suburbs or versus the outer eastern suburbs, or perhaps even in regional areas?
Once again, a good question, Karen. The things to there are five important points to get right when you're selling, and it's best to think of it like this: getting a sensible feet on the ground estimate of value, looking at the presentation, looking at the time of the sale, timing of the sale, the method of the sale, choice of agent, working out what is a sensible fee to pay the selling agent, looking at the marketing costs, and then importantly, as we've just spoken about, the negotiation. Now, in terms of answering the question, inner versus outer east suburbs and regional areas, I think probably one of those key points that I've just quickly summarised is about the method of sale. And the choice of how you sell, the sale methodology, will depend on where the property is, what type of property it is, what the market sentiment is like at the time, and you then determine the correct method of sale, whether it's by auction, whether it's a form of private sale or whether it's, an expression of interest campaign. So it largely depends on where and what the property is.
And that's generally driven, I guess, Karen, by factors. When you're in the inner suburbs, you tend to find that there'll be more buyers than there are properties available of that particular type. But when you go out into outer suburbs or perhaps even regional areas, you'll tend to find that there's more properties available than there are buyers around, and that generally doesn't work well for an auction process. It's much better for a private sale. So it's a case of understanding the local market and what's going to work best for that type of property.
Now, we've got a question from Peter asking, is it best to sell an investment property with or without the property being tenanted?
That's a really good question, Peter, and it depends to a certain extent on the property and the tenant that's maybe in that property. If, for example, you've got a tenant that presents the property well, really looks after it, their furniture fits well within there, and they're also on a month-to-month lease or perhaps coming towards the end of a fixed-term lease, then it may be worth considering keeping the tenant in, because it does lend itself then to selling the property to another prospective investor or to an owner-occupier who can see that they will be able to move into the property sooner rather than later. But if you've got a long-term tenant in place, or their furniture doesn't fit and the property doesn't present well, then you would be much better off having the tenant move on, giving the property a little bit of a fix-up, and perhaps using a stylist and maybe even putting some rental furniture in, and then putting it on the market.
Jarrod, I think the hope is that one's investment property will be nicely presented, because at the end of the day, that will save the cost of hiring in furniture, that will save the cost of cosmetic improvements, and it'll also save loss of rent.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay, our next one, we've got one here from Christopher. How do off-market listings work? As a buyer, how do I hear about them, and is it worth selling off-market?
Okay, well look, let's take the buyer perspective first. A lot of the time, property is traded quietly through established networks, and particularly in more outer lying areas, whether it's outer suburban areas or regional areas. So my advice, and this is what we've done for clients on a number of occasions, is you establish contact with the key source of the supply. So what I mean by that is getting to know the local agents who have the predominant share of new business. And often you can pick up a property before it actually hits the market. So really what it means, in a very practical sense, is ringing them at least once a week to find out what they've been looking at, what's coming onto the market, so that you get in through the door before the rest of the market. And often that's how it works. When it comes to actually selling a property as a vendor, I'm not so sure that it's a particularly good idea to not let the market, in a broad sense, know that your property is for sale. So it's all very well for an agent to say to you, well, look, I've got a list of registered buyers. But, at the end of the day, there are always new buyers coming into the marketplace. And at the end of the day, you've got to tell people that your property is for sale. And obviously, the more people who know about your property, hopefully, the greater the level of competition that can be brought to a head by achieving a really strong sale result.
I think, Richard, the off-market sector of selling property, it gets painted to be this big, wide, mysterious world that only select people know about. It's really not that, and once you can cut through it and get an understanding of that, people come to realise that it's not so spectacular, I don't think.
Now, this is a question that's actually been asked by a number of people. How do I choose an agent, and how do I negotiate the agent's commission?
Yeah, and it's a very good question, and I guess it's part of what we've been discussing tonight. And there's a number of aspects that you need to take into account. So the best thing to do, I guess, to start with is to inspect a number of properties within the area in which you're selling. So you can actually see a few agents in their element and see how they present themselves to the market. Then you'll get a feel for what sort of follow-up you receive. Are they giving you follow-up calls to see if you have interest in the property, or does it drop off? Do you drop off the face of the earth? And another thing to do is to ask a number of questions about the property that perhaps aren't obvious on face value, so that you can get an understanding of, do they have a knowledge of the property? So, for example, if you're looking at an apartment, you could maybe ask, where is the car space? What are the owner's corporation fees? And if the property's leased, what's the current rent, and perhaps how much time is to go on the lease? So that will give a good understanding of how much knowledge that agent does have about the property. Really important, I guess, is their negotiating skills, and I guess it's really hard to find out too much of that unless you actually do get into a negotiation with one of these agents. But certainly asking around and finding that out is pretty important as well.
You know, Jarrod, one of the things that people get terribly concerned about is, how do I negotiate the agent's commission? Now, you know, one of the most important things about the sale of the property is to think about the big picture end result, namely getting a great price. So the different ways to think about this, firstly, you could have a set dollar figure, you could have a percentage of the sale price, and in some situations an incentive arrangement. When we're doing this sort of work on behalf of our clients disposing the property, we do not like to engage in incentive arrangements. We like to think that the choice of the agent and the quality of the agent will drive the correct expectations from the outset. So the business of giving an incentive on top of either a flat fee or a percentage amount, we think can usually be a waste of money, and it's particularly onerous when one's in a very, very strong property market where there's the wind in the sails and in the property market from a sentiment point of view, and often vendors will pay unnecessarily large amounts, extra sums of money on top of what should already be a very healthy commission. It's always a good idea to firstly select someone who is who's demonstrated a very strong track record in selling property, someone, as Jarrod mentioned earlier, who's a good negotiator, and pay them well for carrying out what is a very skilled part of the overall process.
No, I think that's all very, very good points, well made. Another question here, Richard, from Sunil. Is it the right time to dispose investment property in Melbourne? Are some areas more ready than others?
Do you know, Jarrod, when clients ring us and say, look, you know, we're thinking about disposing of a particular property, the first question we ask them is, do you really need to sell the property? Because at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, property, direct property investment is all about buying, holding, never selling, and just let that compound growth build up, so build equity through capital growth, and where possible, you can choose to purchase more property. Now, this current property cycle that we're in at the moment, which has been running in a very, very strong manner for the last 2.5 years, really does show up the good and the bad and the ugly when it comes to properties that perform or don't perform. We are in a market at the moment where if you have a property that is not performing, mainly from a capital growth point of view, then it's really time to sit up, take stock, and dispose of that property, because this climate that we're in at the moment is the best time to be getting rid of a non-performing asset. So if you've got a non-performing asset, take advantage of this market, because ultimately we'll see this market you know, start to level out, and it might, you know, it might go into the doldrums for a year or two, and, you know, at the end of the day, we hate seeing situations, particularly when we meet clients for the first time and they've bought particular properties that haven't been performing. We hate seeing clients sitting on properties that are simply not performing, because at the end of the day, with property, time is everything. Time is irreplaceable, and we really like to maximise the use of time. So the question is, do you really need to sell? That's the first thing you need to ask yourself. And secondly, if you're sitting on a poor performing property, well, now's the time to get rid of it.
Yeah, on the move and get it going.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Katrina's asked us a second question, and that question is, I have more than one unit in an apartment block. Is it better to sell units separately or as a parcel?
That's an interesting question, actually, that one, Richard. I guess it depends to a certain extent on where each of the apartments is positioned within the block. So if they are together and there may be seen by the public or by the general buyers that together they can add extra value. So for instance, if they're neighbouring apartments or one above the other and there's potential to combine them into one, then there may well be a reason to sell them together. But if they're in totally separate parts of a development and they are really separate properties, then I would certainly sell them separately, and I would be likely to sell the better quality one first to set them up a price so that the market has confidence that the properties are worth that sort of level, which will then hopefully drag the perhaps lesser property up to a higher level as well.
Yeah, and you know, Jarrod, if you're if we're talking about a block of units that might be 10 or 20, there are always going to be a couple of units in that particular complex that aren't particularly desirable. For example, like being on the ground floor along the driveway and overlooking the rubbish bin area, etc. So that point about setting a benchmark and setting a price in a unit block is particularly important. Yeah.
Okay, I've got another one here for you, Richard, from Santina. I would like to know how to best present and market a heritage house that is based on the Golden Mile in Brighton that cannot be demolished. Generally, houses that can be demolished would have a higher value than a heritage overlay in this area.
Well, Jarrod, this is a lovely position to be in, to be selling a heritage overlay property. These sort of properties very rarely come on the market, and when they do come on the market, they usually attract a great deal of attention. I think one of the key questions, Santina, that perhaps we can't answer at the moment, but perhaps we can talk with you about later, is what the condition of the property is like. Because, sometimes houses that are in highly original condition often achieve a premium price. And we've seen owners of these types of properties go about spending a lot of money dressing up the house, only to find that buyers resist certain aspects of the improvements. So we need to know here whether this is a very original home where people can actually add value and put their own stamp on the property, or whether it's a property that's pretty much up to date. One of the big things in handling a campaign such as this, and particularly from our point of view, is the significance of generating a great deal of publicity through, judicious discussion with the media. So it's not just an electronic campaign and a print media campaign, but it's also about really serious editorial in national papers and in local papers.
Particularly with properties that have got a real point of difference. That will certainly help from that regard as well.
Now, Jane's asking, why shouldn't I represent myself in selling a property? And, aren't I going to save thousands?
Yeah, I think we've addressed part of this tonight, Jane, with some of Richard's commentary. But look, the main reasons are a professional will take out the emotion that you'll obviously have with your own property. They've obviously got huge amounts of experience from both a negotiating perspective, but also an understanding of how the market works. They'll have a strong database, if you select the right agent, of prospective buyers in that area. So they'll be able to tap into those, which as a member of the general public you won't have access to. And the other thing too is that the marketing costs can be quite expensive if you're having to source them yourself. These agents do this on a very regular basis and will get package deals that will be make the marketing of a property quite cheap, relatively speaking. So there's definitely a good agent will more than make up for the commission that they'll charge along the campaign.
You know, Jarrod, I've often seen situations where people have decided to sell their own property, and you know, in the eyes of purchasers, they see those selling costs, you know, which can often be considerable sums of money, and they'll often use that in the negotiation strategy from a buying point of view to drive the price down. So
I've also actually seen that too, Richard, where it's been the reverse, where buyers have actually not wanted to engage because there hasn't been that independent party in between. So yeah, it can be off-putting from some buyers' perspective as well.
And there's a level of discomfort really between vendor and buyer.
Yeah. Another one here from Lisa. What's the best negotiation strategy for a private treaty property, and how do you maximise price if a property is passed in at auction?
Well, you know, I'll take this question from Lisa as being in two parts. We'll try and focus on the vendor part, given that we're talking about selling property right at the moment. You know, selling a property by private sale is about not overpricing it, not underpricing it, and really having done your homework in terms of comparable sales evidence to be able to justify the asking price. Because you know something, when we're buying property for clients, one of the points that we use is, well, you know, how do you justify the price? So as a vendor, you need to be able to justify your asking price, and you also need to be really clear and firm with the selling agent that that is your price, and you know, get the agent to work really hard at gathering the interest from prospective buyers. The question about, you know, how do you maximise price if a property is passed in an auction? Well, we had an interesting situation recently in Abbotsford where a very good, high-quality property, a townhouse that had, you know, multiple expressions of interest prior to the auction. On the day of the auction, for some reason or other, people simply didn't bid, and whatever that reason was, it ended up in a situation after the auction where the people who could have bid actually regretted not bidding or not making an offer, and it ended up with 3 people competing for the property. And what happened was we were able to create a competitive negotiation situation. So whereby those buyers could have seen their competition out in the open, they weren't able to see their competition post-auction. And you know, bringing it all together in a negotiation process is a skill in its own right.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is.
Yeah. Now, Charles has asked a question, how much of a commission do you pay to have a sales agent?
And look, I mean, this is a difficult one without actually knowing the characteristics of the property, Charles, but it really does depend on the value of the property, the selling method that's likely to be used, perhaps the campaign length that the property may well require, depending on where it's located, and again, going back to that method of sale. But it can generally range from anything from 1% through to 3% of the purchase price. But it's very much dependent upon the location and the type of property that we're looking at. I've got another one here, Richard, from Emily. Realistically, how far in advance of sale should one start discussions with agents?
Well, you know, Jarrod, I'd say well in advance, because there are a number of elements which we've tried to cover tonight, and one of the most important elements is timing. The second other important element, of course, is the presentation, and putting all the different components of a campaign together in a very precise way needs a fair amount of time well ahead. So ideally, if you can start preparing 2 to 3 months ahead of putting a property on the market, in that way you can package up all the different components, put them on the shelf, take them off the shelf, so that you can then put it into the marketplace in a really well thought out, constructed manner.
Yeah, good advice.
Now, a question from Linda: should one buy and sell in the same market bracket? I have a property in the northern Sydney area, and I'm wondering if it is time to sell and reinvest.
It's a good question, Linda. I guess coming back to Richard's favourite saying of buy, hold, never sell and repeat the process, which obviously applies for high-quality investment properties, it really would depend to a certain extent on the type of property that you're selling. So if you've got a good quality investment property, then no, it's probably not. It's probably worth just holding on to it and letting it continue on. But if it's a matter from a lifestyle perspective, so for example you're upsizing or downsizing, then yes, it probably is a good idea to do that, particularly in the current market conditions where we're seeing some pretty good growth. If you do sit out of the market for too long, then your money may not go as far when you do decide to reinvest. So it's quite often a good idea to, and it's not always easy, but in the current market conditions, it may well be, if possible, better to buy first and sell second, because you then get the benefits of selling at potentially a higher level. So that's probably how I would answer that question at this point. Okay, next one, I've got another one from Linda. Am I better to invest and flip a house or buy into an REIT for financial gain?
Well, you know, Jarrod, I'm not a great fan of trying to buy a property and then sell it in a short space of time, and I think that's the short answer to that one. Now, we've got a question from Terry. Am I better marketing a property from the end of August with an auction on the 19th of September, the first day of school holidays, or conducting an extended marketing campaign in the school holidays with an auction date in early October, when the volume of properties on the market is likely to be higher?
I think your initial thoughts there, Terry, are probably going to be the best way to go. Even though, to a certain extent, it will depend on the type of property, because if you've got a family home, and it's more likely to be impacted by school holidays, but the majority of your campaign is going to be during a really good time of spring, as we've said earlier, to get onto the market off the back of winter where there's been a lack of supply, and to get in before that supply really kicks in after the AFL Grand Final. I think that would be you'd be much better off getting in early rather than having to compete with everyone else come the October, and off the back of a lot of people being away. Okay, I've one more here from Neil. Richard, should I try converting a block of apartments of stratum title to a strata title prior to selling them?
I don't think it's critical to do that, Jarrod. Remember that there are three forms of unit ownership. There's company share, there's stratum title, and strata. So I don't think that there's a necessity to change stratum title to strata title. They're both in the same league to a large extent.
Very good.
Now, question from Emily. Is the additional cost of a seller's advocate on top of an agent for standard property justifiable?
Good question. There's a lot of different ways in which a vendor's advocate or seller's advocate can be remunerated, and we've got a number of options that we use with our clients. It can well be that the vendor's advocate is actually remunerated out of the sales commission that's generated, and that vendor's advocate actually accounts for their time and effort directly to the agent, or it can be calculated totally separately, and so the sales commission is paid directly to the agent, and then the vendor's advocate is paid on a separate basis. We certainly think it's the way we conduct ourselves is very, very justifiable. We enable ourselves to step into a vendor's shoes and really take the emotion out and help them make decisions that are in their best interests, rather than them feeling pressured to make decisions that may not be the right way to go. And one of the keys that we certainly feel as though we're able to help with is that negotiation period, particularly come on an auction day, about knowing when is justifiable to put a property on the market, or when perhaps is no, we can potentially extract a little bit more out of this potential purchaser and pass the property in if necessary. So it's certainly worthwhile if you've got the right person working